we have a full crowd, so we are going to get started. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Amber Colbert. I'm the Clark County Museum Administrator, so I oversee this museum. We have a museum in the airport called Howard W. Cannon Aviation Museum and a small museum down in Searchlight. But we have partnered with Henderson Historical Society for this event. But first I kind of want to talk about programming. Programming is the number one way you guys can support not only your local historical society, but your museums. It tells our politicians, it tells our city managers, it tells everybody that we are interested not only in knowing about the history, but preserving the history. So your guys' attendance does help us out. But of course, we couldn't do this without some other friends as well. So we have our museum staff that work hard every day to help us preserve the museum here and make it accessible to... Yes, sorry about that. So we have our friends that help us with our guild as well. We have a nonprofit that supports the museum, and you can always become a member of the guild. And then our volunteers, of course. And we can't forget our partners, like Henderson Historical Society. Every year we try to partner with something with them, and this is this year's event. So I'd like to introduce Danelle. She's one of the board members from Henderson Historical Society.
This is wonderful. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for our partners at the Henderson Museum. They've been our partner forever. Our president, Andy Haven, is out of town, but he left me a list. So we have just a few announcements for you. The Henderson Historical Society is a volunteer board. We have a lot of events. A lot of you come to our events, and we're real happy about that. We have a newsletter. Our second issue of this newsletter is coming out in a few weeks. It has our upcoming events. It has articles that you might like and some historical things that you may not know about Henderson. If you are a member of the Henderson Historical Society, you get it in your email. If you would like it, go to hendersonhistoricalsociety.org and you can subscribe there. It's no cost and you'll get it in your email. A few things that we have coming up. On Saturday, April 26th, we have our Pioneer Industrial Days. It's our annual event. It's our annual members meeting. It will be at the Eagles Hall at 310 West Pacific. That's right on the corner of Pacific and Basic. It's always fun. This year's discussion will be about painting the bee, and I don't know if y'all painted the bee, but I did. We will also have Kelly Lukes from the Las Vegas News Bureau there. She has good things for us, and I think she's bringing the showgirl headdress for us again. And that's always fun to try on. I particularly like that. We'll also have a bus tour, May 3rd, Saturday. We'll have a bus tour of historical Henderson. It leaves from this museum and it comes back to the museum. If you're interested, you can look it up on our website. I'm not sure if there's any more tickets, but you can certainly look for tickets. It's going to be kind of a fun one too. Anyway, I just wanted to thank all of you. And the other thing we're talking about with the Clark County Museum is a program in the spring, Gabbs, Nevada. If any of you know of the connection between Henderson and Nevada and Gabbs, Nevada, it'll be kind of fun, and it kind of goes back to our World War II roots. So thank you all for coming, and look up the hendersonhistoricalsociety.org, and you can see our upcoming events. Thank you.
So I'm sitting down for this role of the discussion, but I want to get started first by introducing our panelists. A lot of them you guys know, but I'd like to introduce. First, right next to me, I have Nathan Hill, and he has worked for local records, government records management for over 30 years. He's currently employed by the City of Henderson as the Archives and Records Manager. He manages legal compliances, oversees record request processes, management of citywide imaging program, and the City Records Center, along with other huge things that you do for the city. Mr. Hill has also served as an instructor for the state of Nevada on intergovernmental preparedness for essential records training, which was developed by FEMA and the Council of State Archivists. Mr. Hill is a native of Las Vegas and graduated from UNLV and Western Archives Institute. Next to Nathan, we have Alan Goya, who is a 32-year resident of Boulder City and a former chairman of the Boulder City's Historical Preservation Committee. His YouTube channel is about Boulder City and it's called Boulder, deals with a variety of subjects regarding Boulder City. And currently he's working with Boulder City volunteers on accessibility issues for the disabled. Right next to Alan is Dennis McBride, and he is also a Nevada native, that's hard to say, who has spent his professional life researching and writing about the history of Hoover Dam, Southern Nevada, his hometown of Boulder City, and Nevada's LGBTQ plus community. McBride has published more than 180 articles, several books, some of which we sell here at this museum, including In the Beginning, A History of Boulder City. Let's see. In addition, he's also established the Boulder City Library Oral History Project to conduct oral history interviews, with Hoover Dam workers and their wives and families, as well as the Las Vegas Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Archives and Oral History Project at UNLV. And he is recently, in 2020, retired as the director of Nevada State Museum. And another retiree joining us, so we're getting them back. This is their comeback show, right? Is Mark Hall-Patton, who retired in 2021 as the museum curator for Clark County Museum System. Mark has also published quite a bit of books, over 450 articles, and he's also produced 48 local history videos. And of course, we all know him for his regular appearances on the History Channel's Pawn Stars as a visiting expert. He served 14 years on the board of the Nevada Museum Association, also the California Association of Museums and Western Museum Association. He's currently serving on the board of the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation and Nevada Aerospace Hall of Fame. He has been in museums for over 40 years and holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of California, Irvine, and did graduate work in museum studies at the University of Delaware. In 2022, he was honored as the Distinguished Nevadan of the Year by the Nevada State System of Higher Education. Yay. And I'd like to start out just with starting the discussion of talking about how honored I am to be up here with these gentlemen. These guys have so much more local history and roots than I can ever want to know, probably, and even know that I wanted to know. Every day I talk to any of them, I've learned something new, and I hope we're going to continue that tonight. So tonight, we are going to learn and dive into the recent designation of Henderson and Boulder City as a joint heritage city. This was given by the National Park. For the audience, you guys will have a opportunity to join the discussion, either sharing a story or question at the end. So we hope that you guys hold those until the end, and we will do kind of a Q&A. But let's get started. So on January 3rd of 2023, so about a year ago, the National Park Service designated Boulder City and Henderson an American World War II heritage city. Now, what does that mean? Nathan right here next to me, I think, can help us out figure out what does that mean and how did they go about doing that?
What does it mean? I get the exciting portion of the evening, the bureaucratic process. The National Park Service established this program under Section 9007 of the John D. Dingell Conservation Management and Recreation Act of 2019. So it's a fairly new program. The designation was to recognize and ensure continued preservation and importance of the history of the United States' involvement in World War II. Each calendar year, the Secretary may designate one or more cities located in one of the several states or a territory of the United States as an American World War II heritage city. Important to note that not more than one city in each state or territory may be designated under this section. There is a loophole that we found that allows a joint designation. So that's how we got it with Boulder City. So it is under a joint designation. They have to be kind of contiguous cities, or at least neighbor cities, that both were important to World War II. So there's some criteria that cities need to meet for this designation. And there's two sections. The first one is contributions by a city and its environs to World War II home front war effort, such as contributions related to adaptations to wartime survival, civil defense preparedness, defense manufacturing, production of foodstuffs and consumer items for armed forces, volunteer participation, war bond drives, personnel serving in the armed forces and their achievements, the presence of armed forces camps, bases, airfields, harbors, repair facilities, and installations. So that's all one category. You don't have to meet all that, but you have to at least have one of those things. And in the second category are achievements by a city and its environs to preserve the heritage and legacy of the city's contributions to the war effort and to preserve World War II history, such as contributions related to establishment of memorials, establishment of museums, parks, and markers, organizing groups of veterans and home front workers and their recognition, presentation of cultural events such as dances, plays, and lectures, like this one, the identification, preservation, restoration, and interpretation of World War II related structures, facilities, and sites, public relations outreach through the print and electronic media and books, or recognition and ceremonies remembering wartime event anniversaries. So that was what we had to describe as part of our application. How this happened was Boulder City approached us, actually. They were going through a historic preservation project and had a consultant on board. And it was the consultant who brought this up. They noticed that, hey, Nevada doesn't have a designated city. Do you guys have some World War II history? So they said, well, we have some, and we know Henderson has some. So they gave me a call in Henderson and said, would you like to participate with us in this application? So we did, and the consultant did a whole lot of the work, so that was wonderful. And we just had to review the application. We provided some narrative, some backup photos, some material to help prove our case. Obviously, Henderson was born as a result of World War II. It would not exist if it weren't for World War II. Boulder City is a sister city to Henderson, has been for a long time in our history, and even sharing a newspaper. And joined in, local matters. We were kind of joined at the hip in battling, Vegas, as it were, and so it made sense for us to be joint designated, and we were happy to do that. So, Henderson does preserve. We've got the Veterans Memorial Wall. We've got the Henderson Walking Tour. We've got the murals. Henderson has done a lot really in recent times to promote its World War II heritage. So this really is part of that effort, continuing that effort to recognize our roots in World War II.
Do you think my mic's not working. Okay. Do you think that there's going to be any future projects based off this designation, or any way it might help the cities kind of get future projects?
Sure. The designation itself, it's a heritage thing, right? It's there's a lot of community interest right now in history, specifically in that era, as we've got quite a bit of time since that era. So people are very interested in finding out what was the role of communities, what was people's lives like then. So there's opportunity to do like we're doing here, to partner with the Historical Society. There are opportunities for signage, things like that, to promote our designation in the city. Just a reminder of how important World War II was to the founding of the city. And obviously we've got, like I said before, our walking tour, which is very much focused on that development of Henderson. There are some grants available to help with things like signage and promoting the designation. So we're in the process of looking into that as well.
Awesome. Alan, I know you were not involved directly with the process, but being in the, involved with preservation of Boulder City, do you have anything you'd like to add about the designation?
Yes, I think, first of all, that Boulder City is proud to be the home of the Veterans Home, State Veterans Home, the Veterans Cemetery, and also Veterans Park, acknowledging, the role of our veterans. And I think that's a story that a lot of people don't know anymore. I mean, people don't know the story of World War II. So I'm really most proud about our city, and great to see all the Boulder City faces here, and my friends in historical preservations and the committee, and there's a lot of people here that have a lot to do with preserving the history of Boulder City, and it was really kind of an honor because it was nice that this came out of city staff. So, and I'd like to acknowledge Michael Mays, the acting city manager, community development. He has lots of hats right now, but acknowledging that this was an important story, and my role is I'm probably the least knowledgeable of it, but I've read everything these guys have written about Boulder City, and all the stories come from them, and I think a lot of these stories have kind of disappeared. And when I read these stories, it's about how America really changes after World War II, and it's our communities are right in the middle of that change. Is like I tell my wife, Lynn, who's the county clerk. Anyway, is when we talk about it's like Clark County, the history of Clark County is really Boulder City, Boulder Highway, and Las Vegas. That's where all our history is, and everything that changes. And I'm really honored to be part of this group and kind of trying to keep the stories alive from that era because they are really important and they really changed America. And I hope we talk about that, how it changed America.
Yeah, so I think we're going to dive right into the history, and I kind of have this directed to you, Ellen and Dennis, is kind of what was happening in Boulder City prior to World War II, kind of leading up to the war.
Well, Boulder City was in decline. One second, okay. Okay, how's that? All right. Well, Boulder City was in decline, actually. The dam structure was finished in 1935, and they went on 36, 37 working on generating the power. So this population of Boulder City was about 7,000 in 1935. By 37, 38, it had dropped below 4,000. And they originally had thought that they were going to tear down the whole city as soon as the dam was finished, and they were just going to have... Can you turn me up?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out why I'm not hearing it.
Okay. Is that better? No? Okay. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, he turned me up. Like happened in Henderson, he was telling us a few minutes ago, there were a lot of people who wanted to stay on in Boulder City because that was the first town they'd ever known. They came to build the dam. They were young. They had their families. They didn't want to leave. So Boulder City sort of just limped along afterwards. And the government wanted to keep Boulder City going. So in 1936, they established the Bureau of Mines pilot plant in Boulder City and some of the old Six Companies buildings. And that became very important in a few years during the Second World War. And they established the Bureau of the Department of Interior, the National Park Service for the dam, Lake Mead National Recreation that was growing. So there was a little bit of things going on like that, but nothing really big happened until before the war. A year or two before, 1939, 1940, the government was pretty certain that we were going to wind up being involved in the war. And so they started making plans and they started building things. They started building Camp Williston, which we'll talk more about in a little bit, but they actually started building Camp Williston, a military police training camp in Boulder City, down around where New Mexico Street, Avenue B, Avenue G, and Adams Boulevard. They started building that in 1940 and had it finished pretty much by early 1941. And then I'll let you talk about BMI and the plans that were going on just at the beginning or before the war.
Yeah. What ended up happening was there was a fellow named Howard Eales who was back in Ohio, had a company called Basic Refractories. It's a company that made fire brick, and he needed magnesite. Magnesite is the mineral that you get magnesium from. Now, he didn't need it for the magnesium, he needed it for his fire brick. But he sent geologists out to Nevada to look for deposits of magnesium or magnesite, and they found this huge deposit, 70 million tons of magnesite and brucite. He filed on that, got that, and at the same time, he realized that, this was in 1939, he realized that there was a war on the horizon. World War II had started in Europe, and it had already started in the East, in China, with the invasion by the Japanese. We weren't involved in it yet, but he knew that something was coming. So he got involved with Major John Bell, who after World War I had acquired from the Germans the plans for a plant that he built in England for making magnesium from magnesite. He bought the plans to build a plant in America, and he needed a place to put it, but in order for that plant to work, he needed lots of water and lots of electricity. I wonder where that's available. The deposits of magnesite were near Gabbs, Nevada. Okay, he's talking to a senator, Patrick McCarran, who says, yeah, that needs to be in Nevada, because he's always looking to bring the bacon home. And so he's pushing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to finance a plant here somewhere close to where the water and the electricity is. Boulder City, can be in Boulder City, but there's this huge area of unimproved land that's just desert. And so they finance the building of 10 plants out in the middle of the desert in this area between Railroad Pass and Pittman, Nevada. Just this open land. And starting in 1941, they start building Basic Magnesium Incorporated. And all of a sudden, we start getting this area, this new plant being built out of nothing. It is just open desert here. They start building the plant. Well, the plant is going to have thousands of workers. There's no place for them to go. Eels doesn't want to build a town here. He wants the workers either to go to Boulder City, well, there's not enough housing there, or to go to Las Vegas. Well, that's too far away. So eventually they say, no, you're going to have to build a town here. You're going to have to build housing here. They don't want them to build a town, but eventually it's going to have to build a town. So they start building Basic town site. Now, all of this Basic, by the way, is based on Basic Refractories in Ohio. That's where Basic comes from. And they start building this, but there's not enough workers. So they start bringing in black workers as well. And we have 2,000 black workers come in to start working in the plant. They weren't hired on the dam. There are only 44 black workers that were hired to build Hoover Dam. And the initial name was Hoover Dam. Then it became Boulder Dam. Then it went back to Hoover Dam, but that was after the war.
No Mongolians, though.
No Mongolians, no. And only 44 blacks. Indians were all right, but that was a whole different part of the story. But they did start building it up. And in order to house the black workers, you got Carver Park, but Carver Park didn't open until 43, so most of the black workers ended up having to live on the west side and commute back and forth. So you had Victory Village being built, you had Henderson, Old Town Henderson being built, but Old Town Henderson, you had workers living in Pittman, you had workers living anywhere they could. You actually had families living in culverts You had workers living anywhere they could, but they built up basic town site. It was basic town site until they finally were going to get a post office here, and they got one, and they named it for Clarence B. Henderson. Now, Clarence B. Henderson got the nod because he was the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and he had been a Nevada senator from northern Nevada, and he never came to Henderson. Now, he did send an autographed photograph.
I want to talk about the housing when you talked about it. He was
Yep.
right. When it's just like at the beginning of Hoover Dam, there were thousands of people moving down here with nowhere to live. So they lived in Ragtown, out in the desert and so on, until eventually they built Boulder City and housing. Well, the same thing happened at the outset here. People were living out in the deserts in many of the same places that they'd lived 10 years before when they were building Hoover Dam. But Boulder City had a great deal to do with the initial housing that they built for the BMI workers. They started building housing in Boulder City for BMI workers about 1940, 41. The Defense Housing Corporation built the Cherry Lane Apartments, which still stand out there, and along the Boulder Highway and New Mexico Street, and along avenues H, I, K, L, and M, where the 6 companies had built a lot of their houses and torn them down afterwards. Well, the Defense Homes Corporation built almost 200 houses out there, and they all still stand. And we think of them as having belonged to the LA Department of Water and Power, which they did after the war, but they were originally built to house BMI workers.
Yep. But that wasn't enough housing. When you're bringing in over 10,000 workers, which is what they needed for the BMI plants, there was just not enough housing anywhere, and they were bringing them in. And the plants, I mean, the BMI was spectacularly successful. They produced over 166 million tons of magnesium there, and they used everyone. They had, yeah, as I say, they brought in black workers as well, it completely changed the demographics of the Vegas Valley. Before the war, we had, I think it was 178 blacks living in the valley here. We had 2,000 come in to work at the plant. It completely changed the demographics of the Vegas Valley. Also, women were working there. They were magnesium Maggies. That's what they were called,
Women's History Month. So
That's
a
right.
lot of those women came from BMI, and they took jobs as politicians, as
Oh,
business
yes.
owners, and it all started them getting their first job at BMI, which was amazing to learn about.
Yeah. BMI also made it into the news during the war as one of the worst examples of war profiteering in World War II, because of Berkeley Bunker, who was a local senator here. He was appointed to fill out the end of Vale Pittman's term as U.S. Senator. He died during his last term as senator, and Berkeley Bunker, in a surprise move, Governor Carville appointed him to fill out the end of his term, and he got very upset by the amount of money that was being spent to build the BMI project and everything that was going on with that. So he started investigating it and started announcing what he was seeing there and how much money it was taking. And he didn't get reelected, by the way. He was announcing this constantly and talking about the fact that this was what he saw as one of the worst examples of war profiteering in World War II. So it was not necessarily the greatest economic use of funds for the wartime efforts. Part of the problem was that Anaconda got involved and bought out Eel's involvement in it. Interestingly, eels got lost in the history of BMI. And by the end of the war, Anaconda Copper ended up being the one that was running BMI. And Eel, his name kind of got lost in the history. And it wasn't until the 1970s that somebody ran into his name again, because it was like, who was this basic person? Why who was this guy? And his name had just gotten lost to history. And a lady who moved to this area in the 60s that you probably knew, Mary Ellen Sadovich, she started researching it and tracked him down. He was still alive and lived in Ohio. And she tracked him down and called him up, looked him up in the phone book, and said, "Can I talk to you?" And he said, "Sure." And she started talking to him over the phone and eventually flew out to talk to him, and he pulled out boxes of all of his records and was able to track down the whole story of what had happened with the plants and that. That's how we know the story of BMI. We didn't actually have this story earlier. So most of what we know now about what happened with the plants. But basically, when you look at Henderson, Nathan was absolutely correct. There would be no Henderson today if it hadn't been for World War II. And basically the tying together of Henderson and Boulder City is absolutely correct. Henderson would not have been here if it hadn't been for Boulder City and for the dam and for Lake Mead and for the power there, because without that, there would have been no reason, no ability for the plants to be here.
So getting back to that connection between Boulder City and Henderson, Dennis, did Camp Williston have any connections to Henderson, and how did Camp Williston kind of start and evolve into what it became?
There are so many interesting stories about Camp Williston. I told you already about where it was in Boulder City. And they started the construction, as I said in the beginning, late 1940. And by February 1941, they sent a bunch of soldiers up from Southern California to move in. Well, it wasn't done. And so they basically, for a couple of days, just hung around Boulder City and with nothing to do until they sent them back to California. And it wasn't until April that all of the barracks were done and they started moving the soldiers in by train from Southern California. It was originally called Camp Seibert, from William Luther Seibert, who was the man who designed the locks on the Panama Canal many years before. And he was also on the Colorado River board that came out to reconnoiter to find a place to build the dam in the 1920s. So they named the camp after him, and in November 1942 they had to change the name because they found there was another Camp Seibert in Alabama. So they changed the name to Camp Williston after somebody that nobody ever heard anything about before. And so the soldiers at Camp Williston originally and for many years into its existence were black soldiers. And I'm going to talk about that because it's really interesting. The black soldiers that showed up at Camp Williston, and you have to know Boulder City and the history of it, that it did not work. Even the original contract between the government and the 6 companies who built the dam specified that employment was only open to white American citizens. It was written right there. So you couldn't live in Boulder City unless you had a job at the dam, and you couldn't have a job at the dam unless you were a white American citizen. So Boulder City, from the very beginning, always had that reputation. So suddenly, in this nice little quaint Mayberry white green little town, shows up 500 black men, and it, as I said, it didn't go over very well. The black soldiers were not welcome at the businesses in Boulder City, except Browder's. Browder's Cafe. Yeah, Ida Browder Ida Browder opened the first cafe, and she was known for letting anybody who wanted to eat or who were hungry to show up at her cafe and be fed, and that included the Native Americans and African Americans, whoever. She had no prejudice at all. But the police kept a very close eye on what the black soldiers did, and there were a lot of stories from that time where black soldiers were blamed for peeping toms at night. They were blamed for harassing Boulder City's white women, and they were arrested and they were put in the brig, or they were sent to jail, or it just was hushed up. And it was really nothing to be terribly proud of. At one point, they had black MPs from Camp Williston down at the dam, 1942. And the white workers, which was most all of them, down at the dam, the white civilian workers complained to such a degree that the government had to get rid of the black MPs and replace them with white MPs. So, but another story about that is that they went door to door in Boulder City trying to raise money for a USO building for the soldiers, but there were so many people who refused to donate or give anything because it would benefit not only the white soldiers but the black ones too, and they didn't want that to happen. But they still supported the soldiers. They had parties. Earl Brothers, who ran the theater, would have special showings just for the soldiers from Camp Williston, not the black ones. And there was another interesting story because it involves BMI. Can I broach that?
The strike?
Yeah, the strike in 1943.
Yep.
The black employees at BMI struck. And the authorities in Boulder City were very concerned because of the black soldiers at Camp Williston. They were afraid that they were going to do something. They were going to come out in solidarity in support of the black strikers at the dam. So what they did, they had black soldiers in Boulder City who were doing perimeter patrols of Camp Williston. The authorities had white soldiers from the Desert Training Center in Southern California and Eastern Arizona. There was a number of tent camps around, and they were training. George Patton ran it. They sent white soldiers up from the Desert Training Center to patrol the perimeter of Camp Williston, and the black soldiers who were patrolling the perimeter of Camp Williston, just to make sure that nothing happened, and they were seriously concerned about that.
I should point out that the one thing that came out of that strike, they didn't get any more money, but they did desegregate the restrooms and the changing rooms at the plant. The blacks working at the plant had the worst jobs at the plant and worked in the worst areas of the plant, but they were able to get the restrooms desegregated and the changing rooms desegregated.
You know, at this point, I'd like to really acknowledge, being just a curious person from Boulder City, I've been reading these stories, and they're like, it really opened my mind. You realize that what World War II happens is it's all hands on deck, right? There's 10 million men fighting the war. There is, everybody has to be activated. And then what you find is the institutional racism in the United States, the model really doesn't work anymore. It's just like women going to the workplace, the roles of women, the roles of minority. Before that, during the dam, it was like if you were this race, you were suitable for this job, or this race, you were suitable for that, or women were suitable for that job or this job. It was secret. You were told what to do. But I think World War II, my father, for example, was in the 442nd. He was in Hawaii, but we find in society where this model of this institutional racism really doesn't work for us anymore. We have to make some changes, and the story is happening here in Boulder City and Henderson, and unveiling of why this thing didn't work and the hypocrisy. And I really want to thank all the historians here for keeping those stories alive, because today when we question the reasons why we have policies like DEI and things, because people have forgotten the stories why we ended up in this place in the first place. Like, after World War II, they said to women, okay, put away your tools, go back and do your housewife thing, because the men need to work now. And it just, the society had basically changed. And I think that the story here in World War II, you find, and I want to thank these historians like Dennis and the Marks, because these stories would have disappeared without them. And I think it's important that and I'm so glad to see everybody here, because we have to keep telling these stories over again, or we forget them, or it just becomes glorious, and World War II is glorious. But, we forget, Roosevelt, who my mother says, I thought he was like the president forever in her generation. She's 98 now, lives in Hawaii. And, but, everybody was on board. They wanted Japanese, black, everybody were on hand. We were going to defend, because Roosevelt talked about freedom, the 5 basic freedoms, and everybody believed in this freedom. And we're telling Europe and, everybody else, we're all about freedom, and that's what the society looked at. And I think it changed, World War II kind of changed our whole society, I think, for the better.
So talking about that change, because it is Women's History Month, we kind of have talked about basic magnesium, but might throw you off, Dennis, but did that change in Boulder City, do you think? Did their roles change, and did that change continue after World War II, or did it kind of go back to what was the status quo before?
I don't know of any women in Boulder City that worked in any kind of war industry. They worked at the dam. They took over some of the male roles at the Bureau of Reclamation, at the Park Service, and at the Bureau of Mines. And there's so many stories. It's hard to keep everything straight. So,
Yeah,
so let me just
I
tell
understand.
some more. The Bureau of Mines I mentioned. How many of you know about the Three Kids Mine? Here, yeah. Yeah, the Three Kids Mine just off to the northeast here. They started mining it in operation in the First World War. Then it kind of went moribund until the Second World War, and they started mining it again. Well, a lot of the manganese ore from Three Kids Mine was hauled out to Boulder City, to the Bureau of Mines, where they refined and produced manganese. 60 tons of that manganese they sent from Boulder City to the 3 United States mints, to San Francisco, Philadelphia, and Denver. And are you familiar with the wartime nickels? Those with the big mint mark on the back? And they weren't made of nickel from 1942 to 45. They were made of copper and silver and manganese. That manganese came from the Three Kids Mine through Boulder City to the mint. So that was one great contribution that Boulder City made too. And the Navy hangar. Should we talk about the Navy hangar now?
Yeah, let's talk about it.
Okay. That story actually starts in 1935. As the lake was rising, James Scrugum, who at that time I think was a congressman, he'd been a governor, he'd been a senator, and at that early, in 1935, he thought that perhaps there could be a naval air base at Hoover Dam. And so, Lake Mead, Hoover Dam. So in 1935, as the lake was rising,
After the coast failed.
yeah, he said they could have perhaps an auxiliary Navy base at the lake outside of Coronado, because the coast. So they brought a couple of amphibian planes up and landed them on the lake just to see if it would work. And some really interesting photographs of it. So he went back to Washington, 36, 37, 38, and he was the chairman of the Navy subcommittee of the Armed Forces Appropriation Committee. So he said, it looks like we can have a Navy base in Boulder City at the lake, and it would save problems if for some reason the West Coast got in trouble during the coming war. So he actually got money from this appropriation. He got $70,000 from Congress to build the Navy hangar at Boulder City, thinking, well, if we build this hangar, they will come. So they built the hangar, and he went back to Congress, 1940-41, asked for money to establish it, and Congress turned him down. They said no. So they never established the Navy base at Lake Mead, but the hangar was built. and still there. It still stands there. It's that great, big, steel-looking building.
Boulder City's still trying to figure out what to do with it.
Still trying to figure out what to do with it. Yeah, it
I
served
think
a
that's where I
lot.
met you the first time, Alan, because I did a presentation last year for the preservation.
Oh, that's right, you were
Yeah.
in the hangar.
Yeah, and I think they're using it for storage.
Storage
Yeah.
of the Public Works Department. It's
Well,
a big garage right
yeah.
now.
Well, at the end of the war, I mean, it had been used during the war a little bit for this and that and the other thing. In 1947, the government gave it to the Department of Interior, the Park Service, and they used it for a while. And then in 1959, they gave it to the city, and the city leased it out and rented it out as a hangar and so on. And then it closed down again, and Anna Maria Davis, I don't know if you remember Anna Maria Davis from Boulder City, was a movie producer. She had the great idea that it could make a great sound stage. And so a lot of us went to have a look at it. I'm surprised I didn't die of hantavirus. It was so filthy. But that's one of the constructions from World War II that still stands in Boulder City, along with the Cherry Lynn Apartments and all those houses and those alphabet streets.
Yeah, we still have a couple buildings from Camp Williston, right?
There's one from Camp Williston, Utah Street and whatever, 6th or 7th.
6, it's the
Yeah.
Women's Club. It's the Women's Club building. It's from, also I understand,
That one. And there's a Quonset hut way on the south end of the high school campus that I think is also left over from World War II.
well,
from
now it's
Camp
heard that
Williston.
the building on the Episcopal Church, the little auxiliary building that was between the high school, was hauled over from Camp Williston also.
Well, those little buildings went everywhere. Some of them went to Kingman, some of them went to Jean, Nevada, here and there, yeah. Searchlight,
Searchlight.
some went to Searchlight, yes. Yeah, and after the war even, they repurposed a lot of those buildings. The Park Service moved into one of those buildings as their headquarters and had a museum. The Boulder City Little Theater operated out of one of those buildings down on New Mexico Street for many years too. But gradually, they were all torn down except the one on Utah Street.
Well, this building is from Boulder City.
Well, yeah,
Amazing.
before the war.
That we're sitting in.
We're
Actually,
taking it home with us
We're
tonight.
taking it home with us. Actually, there are three buildings here from Boulder City at the museum, including, Mark and Dennis say, it was the
Grand Canyon.
Grand
Airlines.
Canyon Airlines store was from Boulder City. So any buildings that somehow Boulder City doesn't want kind of end up here on Boulder Highway at least, it's, in Henderson, so we're still.
In Wilcox houses.
Yeah, but not the Vancouvers.
No.
Oh, that's another interesting little house at the beginning of the war. I mean, there was such a housing shortage. And they were building, this government was building houses for BMI people, but lots of people were moving into Boulder City as well. And so they brought in at the beginning of the war these really cute little houses they called demountables. And they had very thin walls made of Celotex. A guy named Tex Nunley wanted a window, and he just took his knife and cut a hole. And they hauled them in, and they put them on slabs, and they had quite a few of them. They were, Frank Crow Park. They had a whole little neighborhood of these houses built there. And in the 500 block of Avenue M, and in what's now Central Park or Broadbent Park or whatever they call it there were several lined up there. Yeah, and they were still being lived in by people in the 1950s. There's one left, and it's been somewhat altered, not terribly much, but it stands in the alley behind the Flamingo Inn. So if you want to go, go have a look at it, there it still is, and that's the last demountable.
Well, and when you're talking about one left, there's one building left from Carver Park in Henderson. That's the Elks Lodge off of Lake Mead Boulevard. That's actually the cafeteria building for single males. And that's the one building left that's in situ, actually, from Carver Park. And there's one house left from Victory Village. And that was moved to the Catholic Church, and it's used as a storage building there.
Oh, my uncle lived there.
Yeah, but that's all that's left of Victory Village,
My cousin's
and it's
back
been
there.
moved.
Hey, Sherry, it was Uncle Bobby. Who lived in Victory Village.
But it's interesting too, when you look at World War II and you look at the few photographs that are out there, there's overviews, but trying to track down which structures still exist. And there's some of us that have done that over the years. You get down to the fact that in many cases, there may only be, one left. There can be only one if we're dealing with the Highlander. But it's amazing of all that was here, things are gone. There's places, I had the ability to put up an historic marker up in Tonopah, the Tonopah Army Airfield, and there were thousands of buildings on that airfield. There are 2 hangars left that are still standing, but they sold off all the buildings, and that's mainly what the government would do when they were shutting down a place. They tried to sell off Henderson at the end of the war. Henderson was war surplus. The entire community was surplus. You could have bought Henderson. Now, you couldn't buy Railroad Pass, and you couldn't buy Pittman, but you could buy Henderson. And you couldn't buy Carver Park. That was owned by the county. That was turned over to the county eventually, and because that was owned separately, and that was taken over by the county for low-income housing, because that's what it was. And but the main portion of Henderson, because that was owned by the government. The government had funded it, and the government funded all the factories. So it was put up for sale. You could buy all of it if you wanted to. Nobody did. But they started leasing out portions of factories or individual factories. And when Henderson ended up becoming Henderson, the factories weren't in Henderson. I don't believe they are even now. They're in the county because fire services, emergency services, Henderson couldn't afford. So when Henderson became Henderson, the factories were in the county. They still are. That's part of Clark County. It's not part of Henderson. It's sort of like the Strip. Strip's in Clark County. Thank you very much. They're paying my retirement. I'm very happy about that. But the Henderson, was its own community. And when that was coming up for sale and nobody was buying it, it finally took a weird deal brokered through Pat McCarran and the state, using the state's Colorado River Commission. You got to kind of think about this. You're taking the Colorado River Commission, and they're working with the state to buy Henderson from the feds as surplus.
It was a very similar thing with Boulder City.
59, yes. It gets, when we're dealing with taking over federal land to turn it into a community, things get kind of weird, because now, and I'm going to let you talk about Boulder City, but just to finish, the Colorado River Commission ended up buying it through the state for $1, but actually the down payment was $1, but it was for twice the state's budget through the Colorado River Commission from the feds. And when Henderson then wanted to incorporate in 1953, they couldn't, because nobody owned the land that their houses were sitting on. So they had to talk Pittman into becoming part of Henderson, because the people in Pittman owned the land that they were sitting on. And under state law, you had to own the land you were sitting on. So until Pittman agreed to join, they couldn't incorporate. They finally did agree to join Henderson, but they kept their own post office until 74, I think. So they stayed Pittman, and even though they got the incorporation through, they tried to pull out of Henderson 3 months later. And that's a whole different story. I won't get into that, but then I'll turn it over to you for,
Talk about, yeah, the government owned Boulder City, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of the Interior. And like 1939, 1940-ish, there was beginning to be talk about the government was going to let Boulder City go because they weren't in the city business, they were in the dam business, and they were in the lake business. And so we might get rid of the dam. It was really just the beginning of the war that put a stop to that temporarily. And after the war, the talk started up again. The government wanted to be rid of Boulder City, and there was talk about selling Boulder City to whoever wanted to buy it. And there were serious offers. There were people who said, yeah, I'll buy it. And that went on for a good 10 years before Boulder City was finally incorporated. In fact, when my grandfather died out there before incorporation, we were concerned about burying him out there because we didn't know what was going to happen to Boulder City. So we buried him in Memory Gardens way the hell out in the far, far end of Las Vegas. But yeah, it was a serious thing. And even Camp Williston, people in Boulder City raised a big fuss when the government came in, and we're going to tear it all down, or we're going to sell it off, we're going to do this. And Boulder City had better ideas. Elton Garrett. Yeah, but he wanted to keep the buildings at Camp Williston and establish a southern branch of the University of Nevada in Boulder City in the old Camp Williston buildings. But
we need a southern branch of the University of Nevada here.
yeah, well, they couldn't answer that question, so so off it went.
Dennis, one of your stories, I think is kind of, when I was looking through the archives, and that was surprising, and we can talk about this, that was a defensive measures of the tank traps south of Boulder City, which I just found, I went like, wow, what is this all about? Then it was pretty wild stories when the Nazis were going to invade Boulder City, but you can
I
tell.
think I have those pictures up these are pictures you took, correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
I took those pictures. Well, they had Camp Williston, and it would be very hard to stage a sneak attack on Boulder City from the east or the west or the north. But south of Boulder City was just open land, El Dorado Valley, just as far as you could see, all the way to the El Dorado Mountains. So they figured they had to protect the southern flank of Boulder City. And also the power lines ran through there to Southern California. So they built tank traps, and they put barbed wire fences. They built trenches and foxholes all out through there. And those are still there. All of that stuff is still there.
Right, I mean, I remember going out there, I thought, this is a cattle ranch or something, what is this weird?
It was
Which makes sense.
it was to protect Boulder City from the south,
From
And
invasion,
from invasion.
so, we're ready.
From the searchlight's going to invade us.
It might. But talking about defense too, what about the dam itself? And I know it's a lot's known about the pillboxes and everything
Yeah.
else, but
Well,
for
that's
those
a
of us that
really-
might not know as much
That's
about
a
it.
very interesting story. December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed. That afternoon, it was a Sunday. That afternoon, they waited until the last tourists had come out from the dam from their tours, and they shut it down. They shut down the dam to tourists at that point. And they built defenses around the dam. Many of you probably have seen that pillbox that's on the Arizona side overlooking the dam. There was also one on the Nevada side. I don't know if it's still there. Is it still there?
Well, I know there's a couple on down.
Further down, yeah. And they had soldiers in there, and they had a machine gun. And early in 1942, Grand Canyon Boulder Dam Tours that had the tourist concession on the lake ran tour boats. And they ran a night boat one night in 1942. And they ran it up, they'd run it up to the dam and back again, no problem until then. And they ran their boat up and they shot at it. They shot at it from the pillbox, and so they turned around and got their ass back out of there, you know. So, and they also then, they started, it was the only road, I mean, to get across from Nevada into Arizona, unless you went the long way down to Needles. And so they built gates on both sides of the dam on the Arizona. They had nice pillars, they were really attractive, and gates. And they had convoys. People would drive, they were coming across the dam, you'd stop and you'd wait, and you'd wait, and you'd wait. And they would send you across with soldiers. They'd make you roll your windows up, and if you had a camera or anything, they came along and they'd ask you, if you've got a camera, we're gonna take it and we'll give it back to you on the other side. And they would have a Jeep with soldiers in the front, and a Jeep with soldiers in the middle, and a Jeep with soldiers bringing up the rear. And when they had enough cars lined up, then they'd open the gates and they'd escort you across the dam to the other side, and then they'd do it back the other way. And even if you were working down at the dam, they built this cattle run where if you're coming to work, this sort of corridors that went like this with high walls. And there was a little building there with a big rack, and you had a badge. And you'd give them your badge so they'd have your name, and you'd go on down to work. And then when you got off shift, you'd come back and do it the other way. They'd give you back your badge. That way they could keep track of exactly who was there and when they came and went. And that went on until, well, it was September 3rd, I think, 1945, that they finally reopened the dam. I had a great story from Bob Parker. He was working at the dam, and December 7th, when the news came, he was working for their Bureau of Reclamation, and they sent him down to Southern California the very next day, and they said, buy as much cyclone fencing as you can and have it shipped up here. And he did, and they used that to stretch across the dam under the lake, under the surface of the water, to keep submarines.
Right. Well, would you tell this story about who they're defending by? Is there a story about Nazi saboteurs from Mexico City coming to attack?
That was a long and complicated story, yeah, that there was supposed to have been,
Two guys caught with explosives or something, or they were scoping out sites in a boat on the lake, and it's in the paper at the time.
What year?
It's 42, I believe.
quite early.
No, it's pre-war. It's 1940,
Just at,
39 or 40.
yeah, we hadn't got into the war
Yeah,
yet.
we weren't in the war yet. It's either 39 or 40, because supposedly they were going to try to take out one of the intake towers in order to shut down the electricity production, in order to slow down the production of planes in LA. And so they saw a couple of guys who had accents, German, French, Norwegian, we don't exactly know what kind of accents. This is in the paper at the time. And they rented a boat, and they were coming up to the towers, and they had been scoping out the towers, and they were picked up by the FBI, and they disappeared, and they fall off the radar at that point.
So it never happened.
Yeah, it never happened. Exactly who they were and whether it was a real threat or not,
They don't really know.
yeah, we don't know. The story shows up in the newspaper at the time that they caught these guys, they they were reported, and so the FBI swoop in and are watching them, and they see them checking out the towers of the dam, and they were going to go after them. And so they picked them up, and they've saved the dam from a dreaded Nazi plot.
Yeah, I think they made a movie about that too.
They may have. They've made movies about a lot of weird things. But whether it was a real plot or not,
No, they don't know.
yeah. Yeah, it was in the paper.
I have a couple of gruesome stories, if you'd like to hear.
Are we up for gruesome stories?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's-
Okay. There was a squadron of Vultee aircraft that were flying from Texas to Southern California. And they were flying over the dam, and this was about 42 or 3, maybe. For some reason, one of those planes dipped very low, and there was a cable stretched across the canyon as part of the defenses. And he hit that cable and flipped and went into the water just above the dam. And they never recovered the plane. For many, many years, you could see it underneath on a shelf of rock, kind of rocking. Never recovered his body either, and eventually it just slipped off and fell down into the bottom of the canyon, and is still down there, his body. And another interesting story involves Camp Williston and McKeeversville, or Lakeview, they call it now. There were
Euphemisms.
yeah, McKeeversville. The Civilian Conservation Corps had some utility buildings built down in Lakeview, McKeeversville. In case you don't know Lakeview, they call it McKeeversville. It was the original first settlement, Boulder City settlement, anyway. So there were 3 prisoners in the brig at Williston, and Williston had taken over these little buildings. And they took these guys out of the brig to do some work, and they put them in the pickup, and they had a guard with a gun. And when they got down to these little buildings, the guard went into one of the buildings and put his gun up. I mean, leaned it against the wall with these prisoners that he was supposed to be watching. Well, one of them grabbed the gun and shot him. Almost blew him in half. It was so close. And there were lots of people living around down there still. There was a woman who was sitting out, it was warm, sitting in the shade of her little trailer, and she was knitting. And just was watching all this like a movie right in front of her. And this all happened. And Billy Bates, I don't know if you knew Billy Bates? Billy Bates lived down there, and she was the first one down there to this guy. The prisoners got in the truck and took off and headed off south into El Dorado Valley. And they tracked him down. One of them they didn't find for a couple of days. He was on foot, and they found him hiding under willows out in El Dorado Valley and brought him back. And they had a long trial, and they wound up being sent to prison in Carson City. So those are my gruesome stories.
So at this time, I kind of have a question for all of you guys. Mark, of course, I'm filling your shoes, so I always look to you for advice. And Dennis, I'll take your advice as well. And Alan and Nathan, you guys have way more experience than me as well. But I kind of want to look back at this and say, okay, where do we go from here? We have the designation, but how do we keep remembering these stories and how our communities really helped during a vital time in our country?
I'll start. I really think that one of the things that would be nice to do is to set up a World War II heritage trail that we do with a series of interpretive plaques that tie both Henderson and Boulder City together with interpretive plaques that people could, I mean, you couldn't do it as a walking trail. It's a little bit long for that. But one that we could tie both communities together and, have a similarly designed plaques that people would know what to look for. And it would also be a way of showing those sites and structures that still exist that would be able to hopefully help us preserve those few sites we still have, and make it possible for people to see them. And when you're out, you'll see, oh, look, it's one of those. Let's go over and see what that was.
Well, this is a perfect statement from the city of Boulder City, but the city we have applied for a federal grant to erect signage between Henderson and Boulder City via I-11, Boulder City Parkway, and Veterans Memorial Park Drive, leading to Southern Nevada Veterans Memorial. So we've already applied for that kind of effort to tie our cities together with the history of World War II, acknowledge our history in World War II.
Well, there's
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
one thing that's sort of been stuck in my craw for a long time. People, those of you from Boulder City, do you know that there is a war memorial in Boulder City to the soldiers who were killed, the Boulder City boys who were killed in the Second World War and the Korean War? Did you know about it? Well, yeah. The reason you don't see it is because you instead see a statue of Bob Broadbent, which they put up, and it hides that war memorial that is in the base of that light, just behind it. And I grew up on Avenue B and used to walk to school that way all the time, and always walked past that war memorial and read the names. And it's something about Boulder City and World War II, I think, that's been forgotten and needs to be resuscitated and maybe brought out of the shadow.
Boulder
We've
City
got
Cemetery.
a question.
Yeah,
from
do
the
we have a
audience.
question? Sorry, I don't have a wireless mic, so speak up.
Not a problem, I'm pretty loud. If you can't hear me, I'll yell louder. But I have a question of a topic that wasn't covered. The Boulder City Rifle and Pistol Club is on property that was used by the Army, according to what I know, during the Second World War for target practice.
Yes, you're right.
And since I haven't heard anything about this, I'm wondering if you can expound at all on that little tidbit that I've added.
Well, the Boulder City Rifle and Pistol Club was actually established in the 1930s. And, oh, I didn't see you there. Hi. Yeah, they had a target range for the soldiers at Camp Williston. The Boulder City Rifle and Pistol Club for a long time had someplace else to shoot. They shot down in McKeeversville for a while. They had a clubhouse down there. And the one that they built for Camp Williston, the soldiers, was more uptown kind of thing. It was more substantial. And so whenever the Camp Williston went away, that was one of the things that the Boulder City people kind of took over and used it. And it seems to me there was a little building out there too, a little corrugated iron building out there at some point. That's something I'd have to look in my files to remember. But yeah, as I said, they repurposed so many of the facilities in the buildings, including that range as well. That's all I know about it. Is it still there? I don't know.
We got another question. Lynn?
Well, I have two stories I'd like to hear about. One is Carol Lombard. Not everyone may not know that connection. That's absolutely a World War II connection. And then I'd like to hear about the connection between Camp Williston and the internments.
Well, I can speak to Carol Lombard, and it has a direct Boulder City connection, because Carol Lombard was insisted on going on a war bond drive. Her husband at the time, Clark Gable, did not want her to go, but she insisted on it. So she was out on a war bond drive, but she decided that she wanted to get home. Now, she was down in Phoenix. She was coming back to Hollywood. In order to, at that point, make it to Hollywood, she was going to have to fly up to Las Vegas and then go from Las Vegas back to LA. The problem was, at that point, she was flying on TWA. TWA was an airline that had been the creation of a forced merger between a company called Transcontinental Air Transport and Western Air Express. And when those two were merged, Western Air Express did not want to merge. It was the largest airline in the United States at the beginning of the 1930s, but the Postmaster General forced the merger. Western Air Express was able to keep out one route and stay in existence. The one route it kept out was its route, its original route from Los Angeles to Las Vegas to Salt Lake City. So it kept that route and it stayed in existence. Transcontinental Air Transport, which was a weird airline that flew during the day and you'd land during the day, take the railroad at night, and then fly during the day. It merged with the rest of Western Air Express and created TWA, Transcontinental and Western Airlines, then later on the TWA that you remember. But anyways, it did not fly into Las Vegas originally. Later on in the late 30s, it decided to fly into Las Vegas, but it didn't want to fly into the Las Vegas airport because that was owned by Western Air Express. So it decided that nobody was ever going to want to come into Las Vegas. They were going to fly into Boulder City because people were going to want to go to Boulder City because they were going to want to see the lake and the dam and all of that sort of thing. So it started flying into Boulder City, all fine and good. The problem was Boulder City didn't have lights on the airport, on the runways. And flying up on this flight, they had to fly in at night. Now, this was in December of 1941, late December of 1941, and the airport had already been taken over. The airport, Western Air Express Field, had already become the Las Vegas Army Air Base. So it had already been improved. It already had lights on the airfield. So instead of flying into Boulder City, they flew into the Las Vegas Army Airfield, which handled both civilian and military air flights. Because as soon as the war started, all civilian flights were taken over by the military. Now, she was not supposed to be on that flight, but because she was a big enough star, she bumped military flyers and said, I am going to go home. And she and her mother and the fellow that was in charge of their little group were on that flight. So they flew into what we know of as Nellis today. They flew into there. It was already after dark. They refueled, got a bite to eat, and then took off from there and started flying back to Los Angeles. Problem was they were using the flight charts that they had for TWA. The flight charts that they had were off by 2 degrees because it was based on flying out of Boulder City. And they flew right into double up peak. It was at night, it was absolutely pitch dark. We were already into the war, lights were off, there weren't any lights on the peaks around here, and they flew directly into the mountain. It was because they were using the wrong headings. They were using the headings based on what TWA would have used flying out of Boulder City. Had they flown out of Boulder City, they would have been fine. But they lost everybody on the flight. And of course, you know the whole story about Clark Gable coming over here and waiting out at the Pioneer Saloon. He did not. He was not there. He was in Las Vegas. But don't tell the Pioneer Saloon. They won't believe you.
Well, it's a pretty profitable chair, bar stool that they have there.
And the bullet holes in the wall, the story they tell is not right either, but that's all right. But that's why that unfortunately happened.
And you had a question about the internment camps in
Yeah.
Camp Williston. Well, Camp Williston was for training military police for MPs. So.
You have to speak louder, we can't hear you back there.
Am I still turned on? Oh, here we go. Camp Williston was for training military police. And of course, they sent military police anywhere they needed them, which included the internment camps. The closest one, what, would be Manzanar? Was that
Yeah,
closest to us?
that would be it. Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've heard that story for many years, and you can assume that, they would send them because that's what they were supposed to do. But I could never find a direct correlation, a direct connection between any MPs from Camp Williston that were sent to a given internment camp.
Well, Judy can. Weren't the letters found in your house from the?
The Hayes house.
No, the papers that were found in my house were for a woman down in Arizona at the internment camp down there. I think it's called Poston.
That would
And
be
she had
Poston.
worked down there.
When the story that Lynn's referring to, they found a box of letters, and it was from whoever lived in the house before them had a box of letters, and it was from Japanese attorneys thanking them for the loan after they were released from the internment camp. And I guess when they were in Potsdam, when they released them from the internment camp, they said, "The gates are open, you're free, go away," basically, in the middle of the desert. And so it's actually some of the camp administrators that loaned these Japanese Americans the money to get back to LA. And so these were letters thanking them for that, for the loan, and they were.
And they
it
were
was
found,
actually
found in a house in Boulder City?
found in the house in Boulder City.
And that was turned over to Manzanar. The information, there were photographs and letters and postcards and things like that. It was all given to Manzanar with the Park Service.
Right.
I don't know when they shut down the internment camps, but Camp Williston shut down at the same time the BMI did in November 1944.
Yeah.
So the war was on another year or more, and Camp Williston had shut down and the soldiers had all gone away by that time.
And a lot of the camps were shutting down at the same time.
All right, we have a question up here.
What can you tell me about, or tell us about the 6 companies?
The 6 companies. The 6 companies were 6, actually it was 7, but they called them 6 companies. When they were going to build the dam, it was going to be a public-private partnership, and there was no single construction company in the country that could handle a project that size. And so there were 6 construction companies that went together and called themselves the 6 companies. And as a single entity, the 6 companies, they made their bid to build Hoover Dam, and they were the ones that were granted the contract. So when I say 6 companies, that's what I mean. And 6 companies built houses in Boulder City, and they built utility buildings and all that sort of thing, which were also then repurposed at the end of dam construction.
Well, maybe you can tell the story, Dennis, about who these people were. Henry Kaiser, Bechtel.
It's like trying to name the 7 dwarfs.
Well, they become in World War II, they become the industrial. Kaiser, they figure out government contracts, basically. They know how to work government contracts.
The principal company was Bechtel
Bechtel.
Corporation. And there was a Pacific Bridge Company and.
Right.
Right. And
I
Babcock and Wilcox.
The same guys that.
Sometimes when I'm trying to sleep at night, I say, I'm trying to remember the 6 companies' names and I can never remember them all.
Yeah, but then they'll put you to sleep as you're doing that.
They will, but they did.
And none of them were the ones who built Basic Magnesium. That was
No.
Larry McNeil,
Right.
McNeil Construction.
But there was a connection.
Oh, which one?
Anderson Brothers Building and Supply Company.
Oh,
Boarding
okay,
and
yes,
Supply.
yes,
Anderson
okay,
Brothers
yeah.
Boarding and Supply Company supported the construction of Hoover Dam. They're the ones who had the cafeteria, the mess hall and all that. And then they came back 10 years later and did the same thing when they were building BMI.
That's right.
That's a great connection.
Yeah, the interesting thing, by the way, with McNeil Construction, that was run by Larry McNeil. Larry McNeil is Larry G. McNeil, and if any of you have ever seen Gilmary Street is named for Larry G. McNeil. His middle name is Gilmary. It's right next to Colant Street. It's in town, in Las Vegas. He did that subdivision later on. And, yeah, McNeil Estates. And it's a little funny because I was talking to his grandson and his wife one time, and I was telling them that story, that Gilmary Street was named for him, and his grandson looked at me and said, "Is that what the G stood for?" And I said, yeah. I said, well, I know that because Florence Murphy, who built North Las Vegas Airport at the beginning of World War II, because her husband and their partner went off to train pilots down at Kingman and left her with a half-built airport. So she taught herself how to run a bulldozer and all of this and built the airport. We opened it on December 7th, 1941. But she ended up becoming the first female vice president of a scheduled airline in the United States. McNeil was the president of the board. He wanted to name a street for her. She didn't want a street named for her. So she said, okay, you can name a street for me using my real first name, which I haven't used since first grade because I hate it, if you use your real middle name. So we have a Colant Street and a Gilmary Street in McNeil Estates. And they were streets that people had no idea who these streets were named for.
Well, the same 6 company people, they come during the war, they construct the next biggest government contract, which is the Alcan Highway, which was a secret project to defend Alaska, which was a cost and 10% guaranteed. These people become rich. Kaiser goes to Oakland and builds transport ships, and they become
Liberty ships.
Liberty ships, and these are the people that become, and Shea. I mean, they all profit from the war after building the dam. These are the people that become.
They figure out how to do it.
They knew how to do it. They knew how to do government contracts, and become the wealthiest men in the nation because of World War II. Basically. And they started here in Boulder City, little startups.
Do we have any other questions as we wrap up? Anybody else have a question or story they'd like to share? All right, so at this time, I'd like to recognize, we do actually have a representative from Boulder City. We have one of the city council members, Denise Ashurst. Would you like to add any comments? All right. Also, I'd want to thank, I do see that there's a couple service members up here. Can you guys raise your hand if you have served our country so we can all thank you guys. Thank you so much. I would not be here without you. And I guess on that note, we'll be